Truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
In explosive testimony, former acting Attorney General Sally Yates told the hearing that when she discovered that Trump's national security advisor Michael Flynn was lying and that the Russians knew he was lying, she had to act.
Because not only did we believe that the Russians knew this, but that they likely had proof of this information. And that created a compromise situation, a situation where the national security advisor essentially could be blackmailed by the Russians.
Vice President Mike Pence had gone on television saying General Flynn had not discussed lifting sanctions when he met the Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak. Flynn had lied to him. Yates said she informed the White House counsel, the president's lawyer Don McGahn, that Flynn had been compromised and that the vice president had been lied to. This, she said, was his immediate response.
The issue that he raised, he wasn't clear on, was why we cared that Michael Flynn had lied to the vice president and others.
The timeline of these events is important. Sally Yates alerted the White House on the 26th of January, and yet Flynn stayed in his job for another 18 days, despite the White House being warned that he was at risk of blackmail during that 18-day period. He was involved in key national security decisions and even sat in on a phone call between President Trump and President Putin. Former Obama administration officials have revealed that this meeting, shortly after November's election, the former president had warned Trump about General Flynn. He ignored this advice and hired him as national security advisor anyway. He's now under investigation by the FBI. The former acting attorney general said she couldn't discuss this as it's classified, but her words suggest there are more details to this story still to emerge.
My knowledge of his underlying conduct is based on classified information, and so I can't reveal what that underlying conduct is.
When Flynn was finally fired after 24 days in the job, at the time, this was the White House explanation.
We got to a point not based on a legal issue, but based on a trust issue, where the level of trust between the president and General Flynn had eroded to the point where he felt he had to make a change.
There are many troubling questions now facing the White House. Flynn appears to have lied, the vice president repeated his lies. But did the White House lie too about his conduct and about exactly why he was fired? James Bays, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Was entitled to know that the information he had been given and that he was relaying to the American public wasn't true. And that created a compromise situation, a situation where the national security advisor essentially could be blackmailed by the Russians. We told them that we were giving them all of this information so that they could take action, the action that they deemed appropriate.
Sally Yates, she was the acting attorney general until she was fired by President Trump over the executive order on the travel ban and not moving forward with that, defending it. She's talking about warning the White House counsel about Michael Flynn, the national security advisor at the time. There you see December 29th, the Obama administration announcing sanctions against Russia. You have Flynn speaking with the Russian ambassador multiple times that day. January 26th, Sally Yates warns the White House counsel, Don McGahn, about Flynn lying and saying that that could potentially compromise him. February 8th, Flynn denies discussing the sanctions with Russian officials in a Washington Post piece. He then has to say he has no recollection of discussing sanctions. February 13th, Flynn resigns from his national security advisor post. That's where we are. Testimony today, a long hearing. Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief for the Weekly Standard. Mercedes Schlapp, columnist for the Washington Times. Anna Palmer, senior Washington correspondent for Politico, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Okay, Steve, thoughts on the day?
Well, what we need most in all of this discussion that we've been having now for 5+ months is new information. We need something to break through. We need some clarity on what's happening. We didn't get that today. I think what we got was more of the same. Mike Flynn made mistakes, exercised bad judgment. But on question after question, both James Clapper and Sally Yates hid behind classification. One would hope that if this matter continues, and we're certain that it will, somebody somewhere will say, we need to see this stuff. The American public needs to see this stuff. Whether you're talking about the transcripts of what Mike Flynn said in his conversation with Sergei Kislyak, whether you're talking about requests for unmasking, all of these things that are being debated without the benefit of the public seeing what's actually the substantive claims being made.
One thing we did learn, the New York Times had a piece in which they said the former president, or as he was president, leaving, Mr. Obama, who had fired General Flynn as the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, told President Trump that he would have profound concerns about Mr. Flynn becoming a top national security aide. It goes on to say Flynn's name came up during the broader discussion about personnel issues, and Mr. Obama's concerns about Mr. Flynn were largely about his mismanagement, and he goes on about warning Trump about Flynn. Here is Sean Spicer asked that question today.
It's true that President Obama made it known that he wasn't exactly a fan of General Flynn's, which is frankly shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, that given that General Flynn had worked for President Obama, was an outspoken critic of President Obama's shortcomings. If President Obama was truly concerned about General Flynn, why didn't he suspend General Flynn's security clearance, which they had just reapproved months earlier? Additionally, why did the Obama administration let Flynn go to Russia for a paid speaking engagement?
Yeah.
Well, certainly, I think what you're seeing is the White House try to push back on the narrative that the Obama administration gave them much of a heads up, that they thought Flynn wasn't going to be a good actor for them. I think we saw this with Sean Spicer. We also saw it with what Donald Trump was trying to tweet to send some signals to Senate Republicans about what he wanted to hear from them.
Yeah, in those tweets, General Flynn was given the highest security clearance by the Obama administration, but the fake news seldom likes talking about that. And then the president tweeting, ask Sally Yates under oath if she knows how classified information got into the newspapers, soon after she explained it to White House counsel. Mercedes, those questions were asked.
That's right.
And they said they didn't know.
Well, and they couldn't provide, they didn't know, and I think that one of the things they kept going back to is the fact, well, we got to go into a classified setting in order to have these sorts of discussions. But there's multiple storylines going on during this testimony, one being the Republicans honing in on the leaks of the classified information, also the executive order where Yates basically said that she didn't support the executive order, she thought it was unlawful, and then the Democrats, on the other hand, still probing on the fact of are there Russian ties between the Trump campaign officials and the Russians, basically. So I think that for Yates in general, that storyline of the leaks of who got that information, I think Lindsey Graham really honed in on it to say, you know, Clapper, that there's very few people who have access to this information, and he wants to get down to the bottom of this.
Yeah, and the unmasking of the names. You know, there is a paper trail someplace at the NSA of who ordered that.
Look, there are several storylines, and these hours and hours of hearing advanced, not one of them. We learned nothing today that we didn't know yesterday. There's a classic case of sort of a video event that lives only to dramatize things, but not to add to our fund of knowledge. And we live in an age where that can sometimes work. You know, the video of the United Airlines guy, if it hadn't been on video, we never would have talked about it. But because it was dramatized, it became a huge event. There is nothing that was said today that we didn't already know. The only result of these hours of hearing is that Sally Yates is now a Democratic star, and she needs to pick a state and run for the Senate. She is a rising candidate for the future. I mean, and her answer on the question, why did you resign and all that, was exactly right. It would be nice if we had a tradition in our government where people resign on principle. You could say it was a cheap shot. She was leaving 3 days later anyway. But it's refreshing. I don't think since Cyrus Vance and the Iran raid in 1979, that we had a high official who resigns. And then the administration was right to fire her. If you can't carry out the president's orders, you're gone. So everything was right on both sides. But the bottom line is, we learned zero.
If the Washington Post had not come out with that story, this is a question I asked Britt earlier, is Michael Flynn still National Security Advisor today?
No, because he would have screwed up on something else between then and now, and that's the only reason.
Steve.
Look, on the question of President Obama saying that he warned President Trump about Mike Flynn, that's a bit disingenuous from President Obama. Mike Flynn was one of President Obama's harshest critics, particularly as it relates to Islamic radicalism, Al-Qaeda, the growth of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And Mike Flynn was 100% right about that. Whatever you think about what he did here, whatever you think about his explanation since, he was right about that. He was sounding the alarms. This was at a time when President Obama was saying that Al-Qaeda was on the run. They weren't on the run, and Mike Flynn was right about that. Having said that, the idea that Sean Spicer would say, well, you know, the Obama administration should have pulled Mike Flynn's clearances. Can you imagine what how the Trump campaign would have responded if the Obama administration had pulled his clearances as he's campaigning for Donald Trump?
The Trump campaign should have worried about vetting Michael Flynn, doing that, having that be a primary job, so they would have avoided this headache that now they have. But I do think one of the questions that has been raised during the testimony, and I think it's worth pursuing, is why did the Trump administration keep Flynn on from that January 26th to the February, the 18 days, when they had this information and Flynn was still attending classified briefings and in these calls with Flynn? I think that's critical.
Posited that perhaps it's because he was concerned about other people and other communications. And he just threw that out there in the hearing, saying this is maybe one of the reasons. And nobody answered, said, I have no answer for you, but he just kind of threw it out there. So clearly that's the thinking of where the Democrats are in their head. I want to play this soundbite. This is from Meet the Press, and Senator Lindsey Graham and I asked about this, whether Clapper sticks by it.
We did not include any evidence in our report, and I say our, that's NSA, FBI, and CIA with my office, the Director of National Intelligence, that had any reflection of collusion between members of the Trump campaign and the Russians. There was no evidence of that included in our report.
I understand that, but does it exist?
Not to my knowledge.
Is that still accurate?
It is.
My answer to that question would require me to reveal classified information. I think that Director Clapper also said that he was unaware of the FBI counterintelligence investigation.
So, I mean, just putting that all together for the audience, you have this report that is said to be signed off by the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, not every intelligence, but essentially the Director of National Intelligence is giving this report and coming to the conclusion that they didn't have evidence of collusion. Sally Yates is saying, I can't talk about it because there was an ongoing investigation that he didn't know about.
Right. I mean, that's the question here, right? I mean, Clapper stood by that testimony, saying to the best of his knowledge again today that there wasn't happening. But it appears that there was obviously an investigation happening that, you know, for whatever reason, people beneath him weren't giving him that information.
So is it because it was in its infancy? It just didn't make it into the report? I mean, it seems like a big disconnect here. And now we are well into this administration, and we still don't have evidence of collusion. It's not there yet.
Well, there, yeah.
But Democrats continue to say that it's there, essentially.
Of course. What else do they have? You know, when you say it's not there yet, that assumes it's going to come out. What's going to come out? I don't even understand what collusion means. What does it mean?
Knowing when the WikiLeaks was going to be released, orchestrating the timing of the Access Hollywood tape comes out, and then the emails are released the same day.
If that's what was going on, there'd be so many parties involved. The idea that we would have no evidence of it right now wouldn't have been leaked to any of the news organizations is highly improbable. And I think it's just the Democrats pursuing a conspiracy theory. When I heard the senator from Minnesota, Franken, talking about his tremendously elaborate theory, I was thinking, you know, who gave him the tinfoil hat? I mean, that's so way out there. It was a great theory. It would make a good novel. But show me any evidence. What you've got, people who are involved with Russians, and you get the Russians involved in the election without a shred of evidence connecting them. So until you get it, it's a concoction by the Democrats. I'm open to evidence. Show it to me.
Just moments ago, the president tweeted, Sally Yates made the fake media extremely unhappy today. She said nothing but old news. So we will wrap up this panel on that.